She touched the wedding dress, and her granddaughter slapped her. Eleanor Brooks, 72, didn't stumble. She straightened the hanger instead. The gown wasn't hers, but the moment now was. So she wore white to the wedding, calm, elegant, and uninvited. By dessert, the guests weren't clapping for the bride. They were watching the woman who'd reclaimed the aisle without saying a word. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The bridal suite had been staged like something from a high-end lifestyle magazine. Soft blush flowers in glass vases, a champagne cart with etched flutes, and a full-length mirror lit by antique sconces on either side. The windows, tall and narrow, let in the crisp Santa Fe sunlight, filtering gold across the adobe walls and catching the shimmer of the wedding dress that hung on its custom stand like a relic. Maggie Kane stepped in quietly, careful not to disturb anything, though the irony wasn't lost on her. This was her estate, hers in name and deed, but in this moment it felt like she had been reduced to a guest in someone else's life. She held a small silk ribbon between her fingers, delicate and pale ivory, a piece trimmed decades ago from the hem of her own wedding gown. It had taken her most of the morning to find it in the cedar box at the back of her closet, pressed flat between the pages of an old event contract she'd once used to start her business. She hadn't planned a speech. Maggie didn't believe in big gestures, but she thought maybe if she simply offered it to Lacey, if she placed it somewhere subtle, tucked into the train perhaps, or stitched inside the lining, it might be a quiet way of saying, "You came from somewhere, and someone." The dress was on display now, mid-steaming, held up by two of the stylists Carmen had imported from L.A. Lacey stood nearby in her robe, distracted by something on her phone, while Carmen reviewed an itinerary printed on heavy cardstock. Maggie took one step closer. No one acknowledged her. The room buzzed with low voices and the hum of the handheld steamer. She moved toward the train, stopping a foot away, and reached out with the smallest gesture, just to touch the hem with her fingertips, the way one might brush a page in a sacred book. And then, without warning, Lacey turned. Her hand came down fast, slapping Maggie's wrist hard enough to sting. "Don't touch it," Lacey said, each word clipped and cutting. "It's delicate, and it's not yours." The room went still. The stylists looked down, suddenly preoccupied with their tools. Carmen didn't look up at all, though the corner of her mouth pulled tight in what could only be described as amusement. Maggie didn't speak. She didn't flinch, but her fingers slowly curled inward, and the ribbon slipped to the floor like a leaf on the wind. She stepped back, pressing her lips together to keep them from trembling. The air in the room had shifted. It was no longer warm or celebratory. It was cold, almost clinical, as if she were an intruder who had wandered into a closed set. From the far end of the room, Carmen's voice cut through the silence, syrupy and condescending. "Let the young have their shine, huh?" she said, not bothering to make eye contact. Maggie nodded once, not to agree, but to acknowledge something deeper, a final, painful truth she had refused to believe until now. She turned and left without a word. The hallway was quiet, a long stretch of clay-colored tiles and hand-woven runners, the same ones she had picked out from a local artisan 5 years ago when she renovated the house herself. The details were hers. The space was hers, but she could feel the edges of her presence being erased one corner at a time. By the time she reached her guest suite, her hand still faintly red from the slap, the weight of the moment had settled in her chest like dust after an explosion. She closed the door gently behind her, walked to the vanity, and sat down without removing her shoes. A welcome basket waited on the dresser, filled with herbal teas and a single protein bar, something generic and thoughtless. She stared at it for a long moment before pushing it aside. That night, as the sun melted behind the distant hills, painting the New Mexico sky in streaks of fire and rust, her phone buzzed. The screen lit up with Joanna's name. Maggie answered, holding the phone to her ear without greeting. Joanna's voice came through steady and sharp. "What happened?" There was a pause, as if the right words were being sifted from ash. Maggie exhaled. Her voice was soft but unwavering. "I was dismissed." Joanna didn't say anything at first. The line was silent, charged. Then finally she spoke, her tone calm but edged with steel. "Let them think they've won. Just make sure you're the one writing the ending." Maggie looked toward the closet, where her own gown hung inside a garment bag she hadn't opened in years. Something in her expression shifted. Maggie stood in the hallway just before dawn, her coffee untouched on the sideboard, already gone lukewarm. The adobe walls around her caught the faint blue of early morning, still shadowed, still quiet. Somewhere down the corridor, the wedding staff was beginning to stir, heels clicking, carts rolling, whispers already rising behind half-closed doors. She tapped her phone screen again. No notification, no message, no link to any formal invite. Maybe she thought it had gotten lost, or delayed, or forgotten in a shuffle of endless spreadsheets and Pinterest boards and vision decks Carmen had been flaunting since July. But as the coffee cooled and the desert light grew stronger, Maggie knew better. She sat down at the wide oak desk in the guest suite and opened the wedding website on her laptop. Joanna had forwarded it earlier in the week, even though it had never been officially shared with Maggie. The site loaded with a soft chime, doves, lace trim, scripted fonts that made Maggie squint. A photo of Lacey and Evan filled the screen. Evan looked as he always did, neutral, leaning slightly away, as if afraid of committing to a single facial expression. Maggie clicked through the tabs. Our story. Weekend itinerary. Bridal party. Travel and lodging. Each page carefully curated with filters and buzzwords. Love, legacy, light. But nowhere in the listed families, nowhere in the bridal party introductions or the paragraph-long caption beneath Lacey's photo was Maggie's name. She clicked on the seating chart tab, jaw tight. The guest list was alphabetized. Kane, Derek, Kane, Laura, Kane, Lacey, Kane, plus one elder guest. Maggie stared. The cursor blinked. They hadn't even bothered to type her name. A knock came at the door, tentative. Carmen entered before Maggie answered, armed with a clipboard and an over-practiced smile. She was already in full wedding planner armor, black jumpsuit, hair slicked back, tablet in one hand, faux sympathy in her eyes. "I just wanted to do a quick check-in," she said breezily. "Make sure you found your basket and all that." She gestured vaguely at the untouched collection of peppermint tea and trail mix on the dresser. "I noticed something odd," Maggie said, her tone neutral. "I never received an invitation, and my name's not listed on the site." Carmen blinked, not shocked, just calculating. "Oh, that's likely just a formatting error. Happens all the time with these platforms. Squarespace is a nightmare." "A formatting error," Maggie repeated, her voice quiet but edged with steel. "So is forgetting who raised her." Carmen hesitated, lips parting as if to respond, but no words came. Just a tight, professional smile as she tucked the tablet under her arm and nodded once. "I'll bring it up to the bride. I'm sure it was unintentional." Maggie didn't look away. "Don't bother. She was intentional the moment she listed me as elder guest." Carmen took a step back, adjusting her earpiece. "We're all just trying to keep things peaceful today. You understand?" Maggie gave her a look that didn't need translation. A moment later, Carmen was gone. The door shut behind her with a soft click. The silence returned, but this time, it carried weight. Maggie closed the laptop, slow and deliberate, then walked to the window. The sunlight had finally broken past the clouds, pouring over the 5-acre estate like something sacred. From here, she could see the rows of folding chairs already lined up on the lawn. Her chairs, her land, her money, but not her name. The phone rang. Joanna again. Maggie answered on the first ring. "Well?" Joanna asked, skipping pleasantries. "Did you get it yet?" "No," Maggie replied. "No printed invite, no email, not even a text." Joanna let out a low, humorless laugh. "I bet Carmen calls it a tech glitch." She did. There was a pause, and then Joanna said, "You know what this is, don't you? It's not forgetfulness. It's branding. They're building an image, and you don't match it." Maggie turned from the window, resting a hand on the edge of the vanity. "I'm not asking to be center stage." "No," Joanna said firmly. "You're asking to be recognized as the woman who built the stage they're standing on." Maggie let that sink in. A knock came again, this time louder, more insistent. She ended the call and opened the door. Derek stood there, hands in his pockets, shoulders hunched like a child caught between his mother and his daughter. "Mom," he said awkwardly, "I heard about the seating mix-up. Just don't make waves, okay? It's her day. She's stressed." Maggie stared at him, long enough for Derek to drop his eyes. "I made the waves," she said quietly. "She's just riding them." Derek didn't answer. He turned and walked away without another word. Late afternoon sunlight spilled over the sandstone courtyard, catching the rim of Maggie's glasses as she turned a crisp trifold brochure over in her hands. The paper was thick, matte laminated, no expense spared. Raised lettering, rose gold foil along the edges. It looked exactly like the kind of program she used to design, back when brides still asked for her by name. She sat in the shaded alcove just outside the main house, a place she once used as her morning planning corner, now temporarily annexed by Carmen's mobile office. Someone had left a stack of draft programs on the cafe table beside her. Maggie assumed it was intentional. Nothing at this wedding happened by accident. She opened the brochure slowly, one page at a time, already bracing for what she wouldn't find. Welcome message from the bride and groom. Wedding party. Parents of the bride. Parents of the groom. Special thanks. The Kane family section was full of names. Derek and Laura. Distant cousins flown in from Illinois. College friends from Lacey's sorority chapter. Even Carmen had a line in the acknowledgments. For helping make our dream day flawless. But Maggie? Not a word. Not even in the back, where vendors and sponsors were thanked. She wasn't listed under family. She wasn't named under honored guests. She had, in every official sense, been erased. A gust of wind caught the page, fluttering it against her fingers like a rebuke. Footsteps approached. Light, deliberate. Lacey stood at the edge of the archway, her phone in hand, half her face shadowed. She looked down at the program, then back at Maggie. Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh, you got one," she said, like she was commenting on a menu at a restaurant. "I did," Maggie replied. Her voice was calm. She didn't trust herself with anything more. Lacey folded her arms. "Look, I know it's not exactly traditional, but you're not really part of the wedding party. It's more symbolic, you know?" Maggie blinked slowly. "Symbolic." Lacey gave a shrug that made Maggie want to shake her. "It's about optics, Grandma. You said yourself, you're not looking to be the center of attention." "I said I wasn't asking to be," Maggie corrected. "That's not the same thing." Carmen appeared behind Lacey, seemingly out of thin air, holding a clipboard and a paper coffee cup. "I meant to talk to you about your seating," she said smoothly. "We were thinking something more toward the back, by the west arch. It's shaded, more comfortable for older guests." Maggie turned her head toward Carmen so slowly that the movement itself became a statement. "I prefer a clear view of history," she said, "and I don't mind the sun." Carmen's mouth flattened. "It's just a matter of comfort. I've never been more comfortable standing in the truth." Neither woman responded. Lacey scrolled on her phone like she was waiting for someone to rescue her from the conversation. A door creaked open nearby. Joanna stepped out onto the patio, wearing her linen tunic and wide-brimmed hat, sunglasses perched like judgment on her nose. She took one look at Maggie's face and didn't need to ask a thing. "Program?" she asked, already guessing. Maggie nodded and handed it over. Joanna flipped through it once, then again. They really committed to the revisionist version, didn't they? She sat down beside Maggie, crossing her legs with practiced elegance. "You know what?" she said. "I'm going to make my own version." Maggie looked at her, half smiling. "What kind of version?" Joanna's smile widened. "A scrapbook, but not the sentimental kind, the accurate kind. Guest lists, invoices, receipts, bank transfers, photos of you breaking ground on this place in '98. That one feature from Southwest Living, maybe even a page titled, Events I Actually Paid For." Maggie let out a soft laugh. Not bitter, just tired. Inside the house, she could see Derek pass the archway through the open window. He was walking fast, head down, arms folded, a man trying to stay invisible. He'd seen the program, she could tell, but he hadn't said a word. Joanna followed her gaze. "He won't do anything," she said flatly. "He's too used to keeping his head down. And she's good at using that." Maggie inhaled, slow and measured. "He used to be braver." Joanna rested a hand on her arm. "So did you, before you let yourself believe you didn't belong here." Maggie stared down at the program again. Her name was nowhere on it, and yet the paper still sat in her hands. The rehearsal was scheduled for exactly 3 p.m., but by the time Maggie arrived at the courtyard, the bridal party had already assembled, fanned out in loose clusters along the sandstone path. Carmen's headset buzzed with chatter, and 2 assistants stood off to the side with bottled water and laminated cue sheets, as if the entire wedding had been restaged as a production rather than a promise. Maggie paused just outside the archway. The adobe walls radiated heat from the afternoon sun, and the scent of lavender and sun-baked clay drifted up from the garden beds she had planted herself. Years ago, before Lacey had ever met Evan, before Carmen had ever stepped foot on this land. She stepped into the aisle, and several heads turned. Carmen looked up from her clipboard and offered a tight smile, the kind that said she'd rehearsed this moment more than once. "Mrs. Kane," she said, stepping forward with a practiced air. "We've got a seat for you under the guest tent for now, just during the walk-through. It'll be more comfortable in the shade." Maggie didn't break stride. "I'd like to see things from the front," she said simply. Carmen moved to block her gently, one manicured hand outstretched, palm not quite touching. "There's a sequence we're following, and this isn't—" Maggie stepped past her. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't look around. She walked the aisle as if she had built it, which, in a way, she had. Every stone beneath her heels, every potted desert bloom arranged with intention along the rows of chairs, bore her signature. She reached the front row and sat down, spine straight, hands folded in her lap. She didn't glance at Lacey, who stood near the altar with her veil pinned loosely in her hair, arms crossed tight across her chest. The pause that followed wasn't long, but it was loud. No one moved. A few members of the bridal party exchanged glances, unsure whether to laugh or wait for Carmen to declare it a scene. Joanna's voice cut through the heat like a bell. "She belongs exactly there." She said it without raising her voice, yet everyone heard it. Clear, absolute, unshakable. Carmen stiffened but didn't argue. Not with Joanna. Not with the way Maggie had just redefined the front row without asking permission. Lacey's voice came fast and brittle. "This is my rehearsal," she snapped. "It's not about her." Joanna raised an eyebrow. "Then you shouldn't have held it on her land." Lacey turned on her heel and stormed toward the patio, muttering something to Evan, who blinked slowly as if just catching up. Maggie didn't flinch. She didn't follow. She sat still and silent while the others resumed positions, reading from cue sheets, adjusting their timing, pretending nothing had happened. But everyone knew something had. Later, after the sun had dipped low enough to throw long shadows across the courtyard, Maggie returned to her room without a word. She took off her shoes and set them carefully by the door, then walked to her writing desk where a leather-bound day planner lay open. She turned to the next blank page and wrote, in neat cursive, 3:16 p.m., walked the aisle, sat front row. Lacey rattled, Carmen stunned. Below it, she added, "Keep going." Then she reached for her phone. The tailor's contact was still saved under her maiden name, Janine Ellison, bridal plus custom formal, though they hadn't worked together since Maggie retired. Her fingers hovered over the message field for a moment, then typed, "It's time to finish the white dress." A beat. Then she hit send. The gallery went live the next morning. Maggie was brushing her hair by the window when Joanna forwarded the link. A simple message accompanied it. "Thought you might want to see what they're showing off." She opened the gallery on her phone. Lacey and Evan were everywhere, laughing in golden hour light, noses touching on the veranda, posed in the vineyard with champagne flutes held just right. Carmen had hired a pre-wedding photographer to document the entire week, from dress fittings to family arrivals to the rehearsal dinner, and now the preview set was up on a slick, mobile-friendly slideshow. There were group shots of the bridal party, candid smiles from cousins and friends, A three-generation family photo in front of the Adobe entry arch, with Derek in the middle, flanked by Lacey and Laura, arms linked. Maggie wasn't in any of them. Not one. She scrolled back, slow and deliberate, checking each slide with increasing precision. She remembered being there, behind the vineyard, one hand resting on Derek's shoulder during that wide shot they'd staged. She remembered standing between Laura and her youngest granddaughter during the cake tasting. She remembered the pop of the camera flash as she stood with Evan's parents near the wildflower wall she'd personally commissioned 10 years ago. But in the gallery, it was like she'd never existed. She reached the end of the album and stared at the final slide, a quote from Lacey in looping script. "It means everything to celebrate surrounded by those who shaped our love story." The phone buzzed. Another message. Joanna again. This time it was a screenshot from a vendor email sent to the photo team and stylists the week before. Bride requests minimal elderly guest inclusion in key promo materials, focus on young, dynamic moments. Maggie stared at it until the screen dimmed. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. She simply picked up her planner, turned to a fresh page, and wrote, "Erased again. With intention." Across the courtyard, the catering tent flapped gently in the breeze. Somewhere near the pool deck, Carmen was shouting instructions into her headset, her voice rising in clipped syllables over the hum of setup crews and floral teams. Maggie looked down at herself, pressed cotton slacks, sleeveless linen blouse, low heels that didn't hurt. She didn't look fragile. She looked like the kind of woman who still paid attention, still paid bills, still paid. Full stop. She reached for her tablet, tapped open a browser, and typed one name: Sierra Montez. Local lifestyle blogger, Santa Fe-based, fiercely pro-small business, anti-performative luxury, and notorious for exposing hollow pageantry hiding real people. Joanna's idea. Maggie handed the tablet to her friend 10 minutes later on the garden terrace. "Send her whatever you want," she said. "All the facts. Just don't lie." Joanna didn't smile. She just nodded once and got to work. By late afternoon, Sierra Montez had replied with a request for a short phone interview. By evening, the call had happened, and by nightfall, Maggie's inbox held a draft of the post, tentatively titled, "The Matriarch Behind the Venue, How Maggie Kane Built the Dream Her Granddaughter Forgot." Sierra's questions had been simple but pointed. "You were Santa Fe's first woman-owned event venue builder?" Maggie had replied, "I was. I built 3 locations before I was 45. And this venue, this estate, was paid for?" "In cash," she said. "The deed is still in my name." The next morning, the post went live. The wedding sponsor reposted it with a quote beneath Maggie's photo, one taken during the rehearsal, candid and regal, her silver hair backlit by sunlight. "She doesn't just hold legacy, she created it." Within hours, the photo started circling among local wedding circles. Vendors she hadn't worked with in over a decade left comments. Former clients emailed congratulations. Even the estate's own Instagram reshared the article with a caption that subtly omitted Lacey's name entirely. Maggie said nothing. She didn't need to. Carmen did. She cornered Maggie in the breezeway just before brunch setup. Her eyes were wide, her tone low and laced with fury disguised as diplomacy. "This article," she said, waving her phone like it was a legal document, "it's creating confusion about who this event is celebrating." Maggie looked at her calmly. "Confusion only happens when you leave truth out of the picture." "You're jeopardizing partnerships," Carmen hissed. "If you don't back off, I'll revoke your access to the venue. You'll be a guest only, nothing more." Maggie didn't blink. "Then I'll stop being a guest." For the first time, Carmen looked unsteady. The ceremony was set to begin in 30 minutes, and already the lawn had filled with guests fanning themselves under the hot Santa Fe sun. Strings of market lights twinkled above rows of white chairs, perfectly spaced in the courtyard between the flowering desert sage and the hand-tiled fountain Maggie had commissioned when Lacey was 10. The place looked like a bridal magazine spread, flawless, curated, empty of meaning. Maggie stood at the edge of the crowd, holding her clutch and scanning the seating rows slowly, methodically, like a woman counting what had been stolen from her. There was no place card with her name. She moved from row to row, polite smile in place, while murmured greetings floated toward her from cousins she hadn't seen in years. An usher gestured toward the third row. "Kane family," he said vaguely. Maggie shook her head. "I was told first row." He consulted his list. Her name wasn't there. She turned to a nearby server, a young woman carrying a tray of cucumber water. "Excuse me, my seat appears to be missing." The woman looked confused but tried to help. "You might check with the planner?" Maggie found Carmen pacing near the altar, adjusting florals that didn't need adjusting. When she approached, Carmen looked up with a thin, pleasant smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Is there a problem?" "My seat's not there," Maggie said, calm but firm. "No chair, no name card." Carmen didn't blink. "Ask the bride." There was a pause, measured, deliberate. "I'm asking the one responsible for the layout," Maggie replied. Carmen gave a little shrug, exaggerated just enough to show her detachment. "I was told not to assign you to the front. I assumed the change had been discussed." "It hadn't." "Well," Carmen turned back to her clipboard, "you're welcome to find a spot wherever there's space." Maggie looked down the aisle again, this time not with confusion, but with clarity and purpose. She walked calmly to the front row, where the first seat on the aisle sat conspicuously empty. On either side, the groom's parents chatted with guests, unaware. There was space, there was light, there was legacy. What was missing was acknowledgement. From the edge of the garden, Joanna emerged. She carried a folding stool in one hand, a small linen cushion in the other. She caught up to Maggie just as she placed her custom, white linen-covered folding chair in the center of the front row, and sat, one smooth motion, posture straight, hands folded in her lap. Joanna placed the stool beside her and sat without a word. When Maggie looked over, Joanna offered her a glass of water from her own bottle, then murmured just loud enough to be heard, "We're not furniture, you know. We're foundation." Maggie smiled faintly. "I'm starting to remember that." The music began, soft strings winding through the speakers. The crowd rustled, heads turned, then came the stillness that always falls when a bride appears at the end of an aisle. But Maggie didn't turn. She watched the altar instead. Lacey took 2 steps out from behind the trellis, her hand looped through Derek's arm, her veil falling just right beneath the crown of baby's breath and silk ribbon. She was radiant, manufactured, expensive, and furious, because her eyes had already found the front row, and Maggie was there. Unbothered, unapologetic, unmissable. Lacey faltered for the briefest second, just long enough for Derek's grip to tighten on her hand, just long enough for Joanna to see it, smirk, and shift her stool an inch closer to Maggie's chair. Carmen, watching from behind a potted palm, made a sharp gesture to one of the assistants, something frantic, something corrective, but it was too late. Maggie Kane had seated herself where she belonged, and nothing in the program, the seating chart, or the design deck could erase the image now unfolding in real time. The heat had softened into something golden and forgiving, the kind of desert warmth that made everything glow just a little more than it should. It caught the edge of Maggie's dress as she adjusted the hem gently across her lap, the fabric whispering against itself like a secret. It was ivory silk, matte, not flashy, but undeniably elegant. The lines were clean, sleeveless, high-necked, floor-length. A silhouette that respected history and ignored trend. Timeless. She had worn versions of this dress before, in ballrooms and negotiation rooms, and once during the opening of her third venue, when the mayor of Santa Fe had asked her if she designed buildings the way she dressed, without compromise. Now, sitting quietly in the front row, Maggie looked like something no one had rehearsed. Guests whispered, soft, questioning glances passed like wind through the seats behind her. Is that her grandmother? I thought she wasn't coming. God, look at that dress. Carmen heard it first. She turned, trying not to draw attention, but her head snapped toward the front row as if pulled. She narrowed her eyes. Her fingers immediately went to her phone. Joanna leaned slightly toward Maggie, her voice barely above breath. They didn't expect this. Maggie kept her eyes on the altar, but a small smile pulled at the corner of her mouth. She could feel the shift in the air. Guests began leaning toward each other, A murmur rippled across the garden, polite, curious, laced with admiration and confusion. On the small platform, the officiant cleared his throat to begin the vows, but his voice cracked midway through the opening sentence. Lacey's expression faltered, just for a second. She had been staring straight ahead, lips parted, hands clasped tightly with Evan's, but the moment she caught sight of her grandmother, serene, composed, radiant in tailored ivory, something buckled in her carefully arranged composure. Her mouth opened, closed. She blinked. The pause stretched a little too long. Evan didn't notice. He was smiling vaguely, eyes glazed in the way of a man going through motions he didn't quite understand. He looked down at Lacey, then at the officiant, waiting for a cue. But the officiant had also seen Maggie. He stammered, adjusted his notes, and tried again. Carmen, now pale with panic, was furiously typing into her phone just off to the side. Her fingers moved so fast she nearly dropped it twice. The assistant standing near the drinks table glanced at his screen and blinked. Joanna saw it. "Watch this," she whispered. The assistant moved toward Maggie, slow but deliberate, a light shawl folded neatly over one arm. His eyes were kind but uncertain. He reached the front row. "Ma'am," he said softly, "I was asked to bring this, to offer it to you, in case you're cold." Joanna stood before Maggie could respond. "I wouldn't," she said, voice firm enough to stop him mid-reach. "Touch her with that shawl and I swear I'll cancel your catering license before she finishes her vows." The young man froze. He looked from Maggie to Joanna, back to the guests. Maggie turned to him with grace. "Thank you, dear, but I'm perfectly warm." He nodded quickly and stepped back. From the altar, Lacey's jaw clenched. She was still trying to speak, to remember her place in the sequence of words she'd rehearsed, but her gaze kept flicking toward Maggie, toward the silk, the poise, the presence. Joanna sat again, smoothing her skirt. "They dressed her in trends," she said almost to herself, "but you came dressed in truth." The officiant, now clearly rattled, skipped a line in his script. Evan remained oblivious, and Maggie sat still. She wasn't stealing the spotlight. She was absorbing it, quietly, completely. After the vows, while guests began wandering toward the cocktail lawn and servers in crisp black ties offered blood orange spritzers, Carmen gathered the inner circle for family photos. "Let's keep it moving," she called, her voice cheerfully strained. "We're losing light in 30. The adobe wall behind the fountain had been transformed into a photo backdrop, desert florals climbing up trellises, soft uplighting casting shadows in just the right places. A second photographer, different from the morning crew, adjusted her lens beside a large reflector. Carmen had hired her specifically for editorial shots, branded content, Lacey had called it, legacy images for our future. Maggie stood near a potted juniper, quiet, hands clasped in front of her silk dress. She hadn't been told about the photo call. No one had summoned her. She watched as the lineup began forming. Evan in the center, Lacey slightly angled beside him, Derek and Laura on one side, the groom's parents on the other. Carmen hovered like a shadow, adjusting people by the elbow, tilting chins, smoothing lapels. The photographer motioned for one more person to complete the symmetrical spread. Joanna leaned toward Maggie. "Go." Maggie's heels made no sound as she crossed the stone. No one saw her coming until she stepped neatly into the space between Evan and Derek, dead center. A breath caught somewhere behind the lens. Derek stiffened. Evan blinked, confused but compliant, his hand still loosely holding Lacey's. And Lacey, her face didn't change, not at first, but something about the edges of her smile hardened, tightened, then trembled. Maggie turned slightly toward the camera, her posture elegant, unhurried. She placed one hand on Evan's forearm, the other lightly on Derek's shoulder. No words, no requests, just presence. The photographer adjusted her lens, then, click, another shot, then another. No one asked Maggie to move. Carmen approached from the side, hovering behind the lighting crew like she wasn't sure if she should interrupt or implode. She leaned close to the photographer. "Could you, maybe one without her?" The woman behind the lens didn't respond. She just kept snapping, Carmen's smile didn't reach her voice this time. Could we get the bride centered? For this set? Joanna stepped forward before Maggie could even turn. She's centered, Joanna said, in every way that matters. Click, click, click. Each frame sealed the lineup. Maggie didn't linger. After the third shutter, she turned smoothly and stepped away, back toward the edge of the crowd, her dress catching the light one last time before the shadows reclaimed her. The empty space she left between Evan and Derek burned white in the flash, an afterimage, a memory that would refuse to fade. Lacey remained where she stood, smile faltering. Carmen rushed in with a powder brush, dabbing at invisible shine while muttering under her breath. Joanna approached the photographer and extended a small envelope. Nothing dramatic, just a quiet exchange of gratitude. "Make those top-tier resolution," she said. "We're going to want them printed large." The photographer smiled, professional and a little amused. "Already on it." Across the lawn, Maggie reached the garden path and paused, glancing over her shoulder. She didn't need to look long. She knew the image had been captured. She had inserted herself not out of ego, but to remind the frame what legacy actually looked like. Joanna caught up to her a moment later. "Well," she said, fanning herself with a napkin, "you just branded the wedding." Maggie's eyes twinkled, but her voice remained calm. "I gave them something to remember." Joanna glanced back at the photo setup. "They won't be able to crop you out of that one. Not unless they rewrite the entire family tree." They walked together in silence for a moment, just the sound of cicadas rising with the heat and the distant clink of champagne glasses echoing from the courtyard. The post went live just after dusk. Guests were still milling beneath the patio string lights, sipping from coupe glasses and picking at citrus-marinated shrimp skewers when a soft ding sounded from Joanna's phone. She glanced at it, narrowed her eyes and passed it wordlessly to Maggie. The screen glowed with the Instagram post from the wedding's main media sponsor, Desert Bloom Life and Style, a polished lifestyle account with a devoted following across Santa Fe and the Southwest. The photo was unmistakable. Maggie, seated front and center in ivory silk, half-turned toward the camera, her expression composed and luminous beneath the soft blush sky. Evan and Derek flanked her like bookends to a story they didn't quite own, and above it, a caption written not by Carmen, not by Lacey, but by the sponsor's own editor. "Matriarch of the venue, woman who built the story behind the celebration. A legacy you don't stage, you inherit it." Maggie stared at it, unmoving. Below the image, the comments began. "Stunning. She's glowing. Who is this woman? There's power in her face. She's giving respect where it's due. Not the bride, but the one who made the day possible." By the time Maggie handed the phone back, the post had already crossed 4,000 likes. Sierra Montez reshared it to her stories. Then came florists, planners, old clients, boutique photographers, and all of them named her, Maggie Kane. Carmen got the alert within minutes. She was backstage near the pool house, reorganizing a lineup of signature cocktails for the after-party. Her assistant whispered something too softly, and Carmen snatched the phone out of his hand. She read the post once. Then again, she texted the sponsor's editor directly. "Urgent. Please remove the image. That guest wasn't authorized." The response came back 4 minutes later. "We're keeping it. She's the one we're backing." Carmen's eyes flashed. "This is not what we paid for," she hissed to no one in particular. "This is not the face of this brand." But she was wrong. Because that night, Maggie's face became exactly that. The reception tent buzzed with guests whispering and scrolling. At the edge of the bar, 2 cousins passed Joanna's phone between them, pointing. A young DJ assistant paused during setup to Google Maggie's name. Even Evan's mother leaned in during dinner to say, "I saw the post. You looked powerful." Maggie only smiled. "I've always been." Backstage, Lacey was just stepping out of her second dress, a sheer, pearl-studded slip she'd chosen specifically for her reception entrance, when the first whisper reached her. A bridesmaid handed her the phone with a grimace. Lacey read the caption in silence. The muscles in her face didn't move. Then she turned, slow and surgical, and flung her full cocktail glass at the mirror. The splash hit the gown before it hit the glass. Pomegranate and champagne ran like blood down the front of the dress, staining the delicate fabric in a spray of soft violence. Gasps rose from behind her, but no one spoke. The room shifted around her as she stood, shoulders heaving, hands clenched, mascara just beginning to break beneath her eyes. She ripped the dress from her shoulders and let it fall. It hit the tile like an offering no one wanted. Meanwhile, Maggie sat at a small table in the courtyard, the same one she'd once used for bid proposals and blueprint meetings. A server appeared with a small white box tied in twine. "Delivery for Mrs. Kane," he said, placing it gently on the table. Maggie raised an eyebrow. "From?" He smiled. "Anonymous. Came with the florist van about 20 minutes ago?" Inside, she found a dozen hand-cut gardenias and a card that read simply, "Some things bloom late, but they last longer." Joanna sat down beside her and poured them both a glass of elderflower spritz. "Do you hear that?" she asked. Maggie tilted her head. It was the sound of no one mentioning Lacey's name. The reception tent was a living catalogue of effort. Candlelight flickered in crystal cylinders along the center of every farm table, glassware sparkled under canopied chandeliers, and the floral arrangements seemed to sigh under the weight of their own perfection. Lacey had chosen everything down to the linen stitching, a curated palette of blush and bone meant to whisper wealth without shouting it. But all anyone was talking about was Maggie. The air hummed with it. Low murmurs at the bar, glances exchanged during the salad course, side conversations that quieted whenever Lacey walked by, the kind of buzz that made people lean in and pretend they weren't eavesdropping. The toasts were scheduled for 8:30. Carmen had been careful. On the printed timeline, only 3 names were listed under words of celebration: Derek, Laura, and Evan's best man. No open mic, no parental outbursts, and absolutely no grandmother with a trending Instagram photo. Maggie had known she wouldn't be invited to speak. She didn't even bother checking the list. But she did stand, slowly, gracefully, as Derek took his seat, fumbling his wine glass after his speech about growth and new beginnings. The applause had been polite, brief. Joanna rose with her. She didn't need a mic, just her voice, her height, and her timing. "Before the next course," Joanna said, lifting her glass high enough to catch the attention of nearby guests, "I'd like to offer a short toast of my own." Carmen turned her head sharply from across the tent. Lacey froze in mid-step as a server passed her a champagne flute. Joanna's tone was even and clear, her gaze fixed on Maggie. "To the woman who built everything you see here," she said. Every fork paused. Someone whispered, "That's her business partner, isn't it?" Another voice, quieter, "No, her co-founder. That woman was the first to—" But then Maggie stood. She didn't raise her glass at first. She simply turned toward the center of the tent and spoke without amplification. "And to the one who raised the woman who forgot." A silence bloomed across the room like spilled ink. It wasn't hostile. It was full of recognition. Guests glanced at each other. A couple people at table 6 nodded. A distant aunt touched her napkin to the corner of her eye. The photographer paused mid-snap and just let her camera fall. And then, slowly, first from the back, then at scattered tables near the head, came the applause. Not thunderous, but real and growing. Lacey's face stayed motionless for exactly 4 seconds before it broke. Her lip curled, then her breath hitched. And then, like the seam of a dress pulled too tight, she snapped. The champagne flute in her hand shattered as she dropped it to the floor, the delicate crystal splintering against the tile. She turned on her heel, heels clicking hard against the ground, and disappeared through the side flap of the tent into the powder room hallway. Carmen followed, not bothering with excuses. Her clipboard swung in one hand, useless now. Maggie didn't sit. She let the moment sit instead. Let the weight of it hang in the air like the scent of roses and desert air. Then she lifted her glass, finally, and took one slow sip. Joanna leaned closer. "You know," she said, smiling, "I almost brought the scrapbook." Maggie laughed softly. That wasn't the story they were ready to hear. "No," Joanna agreed, "but this one they couldn't ignore." At the far end of the tent, Derek sat slumped in his chair, hands in his lap. His wife whispered something to him, but he didn't answer. He just looked across the tent at his mother, tall, composed, radiant, and knew exactly what he had failed to defend. The music had been all algorithms up to that point, Spotify polished, influencer approved, the kind of wedding playlist built by keywords: ambient, romantic, coastal, luxe, no bass, no risk, no memory. Then, just as dessert was being cleared, a shift, a low hum, a soulful swell, the unmistakable first notes of "At Last." The opening chords wrapped around the room like velvet, slow, deliberate, and defiant of every modern trend. A classic, Etta James, a song with weight. It didn't ask for attention, it commanded it. Heads turned toward the DJ booth. He looked up from his console, brow furrowed, and shrugged slightly, as if even he hadn't cued it. Joanna's brows lifted in delight. "Oh, Carson." At the far edge of the tent, he appeared. Carson Sloane, Joanna's old friend from her event planning days, a retired ballroom instructor, widowed 5 years now, with silver at his temples and spine still upright as a conductor. He moved with the grace of a man who still believed in introductions. He stopped in front of Maggie and extended a hand. "May I?" he asked, his voice rich with intention and none of the artificial warmth everyone else had been selling all evening. Maggie looked up at him for a moment, her lips parting slightly, not from surprise, but from some long dormant place waking back to life. "You may," she said. She took his hand, and then she stood. The tent quieted without a cue. Conversations paused. Napkins stilled mid-dab. Even the bartenders leaned in from behind the counter. The clatter and clink of wedding excess fell away like peeling paint. Maggie stepped onto the dance floor with Carson, not in performance, but in purpose. No spotlight followed her. There was no announcement, no forced attention. And yet, every eye found her. She moved in time with him, slow and certain. No tricks, no flash, just rhythm and presence, the way people danced before cameras told them how. Her dress, ivory, smooth, perfect, flowed like water with every turn, catching light that seemed drawn to her. A circle formed naturally around them. Guests stood, glasses in hand, forming a quiet ring. Nobody spoke. And then the phones came out. Not in intrusion, but in awe. Someone whispered, "That's the matriarch, isn't it?" Another replied, "She is the legacy." Carmen had returned to the tent by then, her makeup refreshed, clipboard nowhere in sight. She stopped cold when she saw the floor. Next to her, Lacey appeared from the powder room, her eyes rimmed in red, a backup dress barely zipped, her lipstick smeared and freshly blotted. Her gaze tracked to the dance floor just as Maggie turned in time with the saxophone swell, Carson's hand at her waist, her expression calm, sovereign. Lacey's jaw tightened. Every bit of image she'd crafted for this night, curated, filtered, focus-grouped, was collapsing under the weight of something real. Maggie and Carson danced not like they were trying to be remembered, but like they already had been, and everyone watching seemed to understand that. Joanna, from the edge of the circle, raised her glass once again and murmured, "History in motion." The music dipped into its final refrain, and Carson brought Maggie into a slow, deliberate turn, one last movement that left her perfectly centered under the canopy lights. When the song ended, there was no applause, just silence, then the shuffle of awe. A moment later, the DJ leaned into the mic, his voice low, unscripted. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. That was unexpected." Maggie turned to Carson, touched his shoulder gently, and stepped back. Her heels clicked softly against the dance floor as she exited the circle the same way she had entered it, without asking permission. The chant started soft, like an obligation. 3, 2, 1, and then the burst. A cannon cracked open overhead, and a glittering hail of biodegradable confetti fluttered down across the estate courtyard, catching in the overhead string lights, in the folds of chiffon dresses, in the gelled hair of guests who'd been standing in formation for nearly 20 minutes waiting on cue. Lacey and Evan stepped through the archway together, her veil pinned again, her bouquet down to the emergency florals, his tie crooked and lip gloss streaked on his cheek. They smiled, wide, gleaming, hollow. Flashes fired from the sponsor's photographer. Someone blew a noisemaker. The crowd clapped, but no one shouted. There was no joy in the exit, only choreography. From the second-floor balcony that overlooked the scene, Maggie watched with a glass of water in her hand. No wine, no garnish, just clean clarity in a clear crystal tumbler held loosely in fingers that didn't tremble. She stood behind the wrought iron railing of the balcony she'd designed herself. The metal still bore the sun-burnished patina of the summer she commissioned it, 1999, right after closing on the land. She had stood there once before, the night they poured the foundation, imagining what legacy might look like one day. She hadn't pictured this, but it still felt earned. Joanna stood beside her now, arms folded lightly, a fresh lipstick print on the rim of her wine glass. "That's the smile of someone who's Googled how to look grateful when you're dead inside," she muttered. Maggie didn't laugh, but she didn't deny it. Below them, Carmen tried to corral guests toward the gate where the getaway car waited, her voice cracking from overuse and nerves. She spotted the balcony, glanced upward, and immediately dropped her eyes. She couldn't look at Maggie. Not anymore. Joanna lifted one hand in a lazy, ironic clap. Clap, clap, clap. Each one deliberate, not loud, but impossible to ignore. A ripple of glances followed. Lacey climbed into the vintage white convertible waiting at the drive's edge, her skirt bunching inelegantly as she ducked inside. Evan slid in beside her, already loosening his collar. The glitter stuck to his forehead. The door shut. The crowd cheered again. Still quiet. Still wrong. But the car didn't pull away. Inside, through the tinted back window, Lacey's eyes were locked forward. Her breath fogged the glass. Her head tilted slightly. She was staring at something. Joanna noticed first. "She sees the camera," she said, just as a man in khakis and a blazer emerged from the West Wing hall with a badge clipped to his lanyard and a notepad in his hand. "Ms. Kane?" he said, approaching Maggie at the top of the stairs. "I'm with KRSF, local segment on women in business. Just 10 minutes if you're free?" Maggie turned. Her face softened into the kind of smile that made people sit up straighter. "I'm free in 5, she said. "I know exactly what I'm wearing." Joanna arched an eyebrow. "Don't tell me it's the pantsuit." "No," Maggie said, already turning toward her suite. "It's the one I designed for the governor's gala in 2004. I just never had a better reason to wear it." The man from KRSF looked impressed. "I'd love to get a shot in front of the balcony if that's okay." Maggie didn't pause. "Of course. It's where legacy stands." And with that, she disappeared down the hall, heels echoing softly on reclaimed wood. Outside, the limo finally started to pull away, its driver weary from delays. The crowd waved half-heartedly. The bride didn't. Inside the car, Lacey turned her head sharply toward the estate's north wing as it receded behind them, just in time to see the camera lights flick on upstairs. The news crew had already begun filming. A makeup artist stepped back from Maggie's face. The lighting tech gave a thumbs up. Joanna stood just off frame, holding the cue cards, not that Maggie needed them. Through the limo glass, the last thing Lacey saw was her grandmother, centered, composed, her smile genuine, being interviewed on the balcony of Lacey's own wedding. And this time, there was no filter strong enough to save the bride from that frame. The interview dropped at 6:42 a.m. The digital version led the homepage of KRSF Morning Features with an elegant banner, "Legacy Unscripted, Maggie Kane on Building Belonging and the Weight of Being Forgotten." In the header photo, Maggie stood on the wrought iron balcony in the soft blush of early morning light, her frame sharp against the adobe walls she had once designed on napkins and floor plans. Her hands rested lightly on the railing, her eyes unapologetically direct. The quote beneath it was simple: "Sometimes legacy skips a generation, but it always returns home." By 8 a.m., the story had been reposted by 5 local magazines, 2 business profiles, and one of the Southwest's fastest-growing feminist media collectives. By 9 a.m., Desert Bloom Life and Style quietly untagged Lacey from their coverage carousel. No announcement, just absence. And by noon, two of Lacey's micro-sponsorships had placed their deals on pause, citing brand misalignment, unexpected shifts in narrative direction, and confusion regarding authenticity metrics. Her image license for the estate's Instagram was quietly pulled. The wedding photos from the vendor shoot were still up, but the captions had changed. Now they focused on community roots, local heritage, and multi-generational brilliance. They all featured Maggie. Never tagged, always named. Carmen's fall was faster. That same afternoon, the estate's management team issued a statement thanking her for her service and announcing a shift away from influencer-centric packages. A politely worded email went out to the next season's brides. "We are no longer offering curated content partnerships. We believe in unfiltered celebration." Joanna forwarded it to Maggie with one line, "Clean sweep." By early evening, Carmen had been removed from the venue's preferred vendor list. The planning account she'd spent 5 years building went dark. Her last story, a pre-scheduled reel featuring Lacey's centerpieces, posted automatically, gathering comments she didn't respond to. Maggie didn't say a word about any of it. She simply returned home, to her smaller, quieter adobe on the east side of town, where the walls still bore the clay fingerprints of the life she'd built herself. She put the heirloom silver away, folded her dress into its preservation box, and watered the garden. It wasn't until later, when the sun had just begun to dip and the shadows lengthened across the tile, that her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. "Derek. Just a text. You never deserved that slap." She stared at it for a long time, then typed, slowly, deliberately, "You didn't stop it either. No period, no anger, just the weight of truth, offered without venom." There was no reply. Outside, cicadas hummed. The breeze carried the faint scent of mesquite and sage. Inside, Maggie set the phone face down and went to the porch. The mail sat in a tidy stack beside the rocking chair. Joanna had collected it while Maggie was gone. On top was a padded envelope from a regional arts foundation, one Maggie hadn't spoken to in years. She opened it. Inside, an invitation. A fall gala in Santa Fe. Theme, Women Who Built It First. She was to be honored with a Lifetime Achievement Award. Press was expected, a feature in Southwest Architect, possibly even a retrospective. There was a handwritten note tucked between the pages. "We should have done this sooner, but your story just reached us now. Congratulations, Maggie." She sat back in the rocker, the light golden and warm across her knees. No spotlights, no confetti, just recognition, earned, unforced, and long overdue. Across town, in a sun-choked condo filled with silk flowers and unopened boxes, Lacey stared at her frozen inbox. No responses, no renewals, no interest. On her own wedding's website, the traffic had flatlined. The only thing that kept pinging was a Google alert. Maggie Kane, legacy interview, now trending in regional media. The spotlight was gone, but the shadow it left, that was shaped exactly like the woman she had tried to erase. The first Monday after the wedding passed quietly. No call came, no card arrived, no embossed envelope with Lacey's new monogram, no handwritten thank you tucked behind a printed photo, not even a text. Maggie hadn't expected fanfare. But silence, that brand of intentional, echoing silence, was something else. She spent the morning at her desk, the same oak-topped one she'd used since before the estate had a name, answering a few lingering emails from local vendors who'd reconnected after the interview aired. A florist offered a standing arrangement for her new studio space. A lighting tech wrote, "Thank you for reminding us who really holds the vision." She replied kindly to each one, then opened a blank sheet of stationery and began to write herself a thank you note. The pen moved slowly, the words deliberate. "Thank you for keeping your promise to yourself, even when no one remembered it was made. Thank you for holding your composure when others mistook it for silence. Thank you for building the thing they stood on, even when they forgot to name you." When she was finished, she signed it simply, MC. August, year of my return. She slid the page into a cream linen frame and placed it on the shelf above her desk, just beside a faded blueprint of the original estate courtyard and a photo of her and Joanna, sunburnt and barefoot, planting the first potted cactus in the West Garden. Joanna arrived just before lunch. She carried a cardboard mailing tube and a small cooler bag. "Leftover champagne," she said, setting the bag on the kitchen counter. "And this, hot off the press." From the tube, she unrolled the front page of Southwest Architect magazine's Legacy issue. There, in full bleed glory, was Maggie. Balcony, blazer, sunlit smile. The pull quote was different from the KRSF headline. "I didn't build for approval. I built to last." Maggie ran her fingers lightly across the print. "They finally asked for the right story," Joanna said. "You just made them remember it existed." Maggie smiled. "No one asks for history. They inherit it when they're ready." They shared lunch on the back porch. Peach salad, goat cheese, leftover dinner rolls. The wind was soft and dry, the kind of afternoon that didn't demand anything from you except to notice it. Carson arrived later, dressed like always in pressed slacks and a collared shirt that looked ironed by sunlight. He carried a single white envelope, unsealed. "This came with the mail for the venue. Left in the chapel, no postmark," he said. "I think it was meant for you." Maggie took it without speaking. Her fingers already knew the paper stock before her eyes confirmed it. Lacey's wedding suite, the cream envelope, the faintly embossed border. Inside was a note. Short. No salutation. "I don't know how to say what should have been said in person, but I saw you. I know what you gave, and I'm sorry we didn't protect it. I should have. You looked like Grace on that floor, like everything Lacey wanted to be, but couldn't fake. Thank you for building the thing we didn't deserve to inherit." There was a second slip of paper folded inside, a photograph. Maggie, mid-dance with Carson. Shoulders back, eyes soft, lips parted in a smile that hadn't belonged to anyone but herself. Joanna leaned over her shoulder, reading. "Evan?" she asked. Maggie nodded once, then walked the note and the photo to her office. She opened a narrow drawer on the bottom row of her filing cabinet, passed over tabs labeled deeds, renovations, permits, until she reached the one she kept unmarked except for a piece of old masking tape scratched in her own handwriting. Truth that mattered. She slid the contents inside, not because she needed the memory, but because someone, someday, might. That night, as the city blinked on in golden clusters below her hill, Maggie stood on her front porch and looked out past the garden wall. No spotlight, no applause, just the quiet weight of clarity. She had danced, she had spoken, she had not disappeared. And in the drawer behind her, tucked where no algorithm could reach it, was proof that someone, just one, had finally said thank you, even if it wasn't the one who should have. The sun poured through the sycamores like warm syrup, slow and golden, casting latticework shadows across the flagstone path that wound through Maggie Kane's garden. She moved through it without rush, one hand brushing the tops of the rosemary hedge, the other carrying a pair of shears that clicked softly as she moved. There was no music, no camera, just cicadas, birdsong, and the soft hum of a wind that had nothing left to prove. Her wide-brimmed hat cast her face in half-shadow, the same face that had smiled from headlines, magazine covers, business features, and one editorial shoot that now lived in a downtown gallery under the title Santa Fe's Quiet Builder. Maggie paused by the rose arch. Pale yellow blooms clustered at the top, Cecile Brunners, planted the year the estate opened. She trimmed 2, left the rest. Some things were meant to bloom quietly, untouched. On the porch, Joanna waited in the wicker chair she'd claimed as her own since the 90s. Her glass of iced tea sweated on the side table, mint leaves floating like little flags of permission. She was reading the Sunday paper, but her eyes weren't on the print. "You know you won," she said, without lifting her gaze. Maggie reached the steps and removed her gloves. She didn't sit yet, just smiled the way people do when they've outgrown the need to correct anyone's version of the story. "That's not why I did it." Joanna laughed softly. "Doesn't mean it's not true." Maggie sank into the chair beside her, crossing one leg gently over the other. The fabric of her linen pants shifted with grace. The house behind them, freshly painted and always clean, stood quiet in the heat. Inside, on the far wall of her office, hung a new frame, Not oversized, not flashy, just deliberate. It was the photo, the one taken during the editorial family set. The one the photographer had posted with no caption and no hashtags, and yet it had circled through every planner's mood board in the region since. Maggie stood at center, ivory silk gleaming beneath filtered sunset light. One hand rested lightly on Evan's arm. Derek stood at her side. Behind her, softly blurred, was the trailing white sweep of Lacey's dress, out of focus, barely lit, secondary. But Maggie? She was sharp. She was serene. She was impossible to crop. When guests asked about the image now, planners referred to it as the shot that shifted things. Some called it elegant, some called it disruptive, some just stared at it quietly and used the phrase rooted truth like it had always existed. Maggie didn't frame it for praise. She framed it to remember. "You ever think about printing the letter from Evan?" Joanna asked, sipping her tea. "No," Maggie said, stretching her legs in the sun. "That one wasn't meant for the wall. It's filed where it belongs." A long silence passed. The kind that only exists between women who've survived enough together that words become optional. Then Joanna stood and disappeared inside for a moment. She returned holding a new envelope. "This just came," she said. "Courier, no return address." Maggie opened it slowly, her eyes scanning the single card inside. It wasn't from Lacey. It was from the venue board. A formal invitation to consult on their seasonal design strategy, full creative control, a stipend, and a line in bold at the bottom. "Our future cannot be curated without the woman who built our past." Maggie tucked it beside her chair for later. She had flowers to arrange first. In the office, beneath the framed photograph, the morning light caught the glass just right, illuminating her face, softening the rest. Lacey's white dress in the background was nearly invisible now. But Maggie was legacy made visible, and the words she had once only said to herself were now the ones the town repeated like gospel. As she looked out at the garden, Joanna handed her a fresh glass of iced tea and said nothing more. There was nothing left to prove, nothing left to win. Just sunlight, breath, and proof that remembrance sometimes grows where erasure once stood. And Maggie, calm and quiet beneath the shade of her porch, thought, "She wore white for attention. I wore it for remembrance, and left with everything that mattered.